Travis Roeder, 365 and SicEm365.com football analyst, is with us now on the show. Craig Smoke, David Smoke, and Travis, top 5 underrated Baylor football players for the upcoming season. Grayson also did his, and there's one player that's on both lists, I think, is offensive lineman Clark Barrington, the transfer from Brigham Young. Travis, let's start with this. It's a great idea, especially during this time of the year. But how hard was it, or was it hard, for you to get down to just 5?
That's always the kind of game you're playing with these articles. It's like you want it to be meaningful. So you don't want to do a list of 27 guys and say the entire team is underrated, right? So I think in some sense it was a bit easier this year because there's so many unknowns on this team. But I think the fan base. Something I've been thinking about is the fact that if you went up to your even just average season ticket holder for Baylor football this year, how many different guys on the team could they even name? And Craig, I know this is something you've alluded to as far as like the star power on the team. Does Baylor have kind of billboard quality guys on the team that you can build an identity around? And I think they do. And so I think kind of part of what I was hoping to do in this article was trying to, name some guys that maybe either fans have a misperception on, or that I just have a higher, feeling on than most do. So it was somewhat easy because, like I was saying, I think there's a lot of unknowns with this team. So it's kind of fun to expound upon a few guys that I'm really high on that maybe the fan base isn't thinking about as much.
And those guys that you're high on, Travis, include a good number of transfers within that 5. 3 of the 5 guys are incoming transfers from this past cycle. Is it hard to kind of calculate underrated there? Like, sort of, how did you debate that? I mean, knowing there's a little bit of a difference in, somebody who obviously everybody's been watching for the last couple of years. And what was it about, Dominic Richardson, for example, that put him in the, underrated category for you?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think part of the benefit of the fact that this is part of my job is, I have the time to basically really watch these guys because I need to be able to know the team. Whereas, your average fan isn't necessarily going to watch a bunch of tape on some transfers. And there's been so many this offseason. So who are the guys you actually need to pay attention to? And so I think, these 3 were the ones that I had my eyes on, which were the 2 BYU offensive linemen, Barrington brothers, and then Dominic Richardson from Oklahoma State. And what really drew me to Dominic Richardson is I think since his transfer announcement, which was back in December, fans have just been like, wait, is this guy any good? Because his numbers at Oklahoma State were not very good. But he's a guy that, I had no really preconceptions about. But when I went and watched the tape, I was like, oh, it was just because Oklahoma State's offensive line last year was basically as good as Matt Rule's 2017 offensive line was. And so for Dominic Richardson to be getting 3.5 yards a carry was kind of like a Herculean effort. And I think we saw with Abram Smith back in 2021 that if you're a lead guy in this offense and if you're getting 20 to 5 carries a game, you're going to put up absolutely insane numbers, and the entire offense is really going to revolve around you. So I think my eyes really went to him as far as being an underrated guy, because I think the fan base is kind of just expecting him to be part of the rotation. Maybe Richard Reese is actually better. From my evaluation, I don't even really think it's close. I really like Richard Reese, but I think he's kind of clearly in the same way Treston Ebner was like a 10 to 15 touch per game kind of guy, and Abram was a 20 to 30 touch per game kind of guy. I think Dominic Richardson is very clearly going to get 20 to 30 carries a game, and I think he's going to be an NFL running back. So I have really high expectations for him.
I'll remember that when they played Oklahoma State, came to Waco for the rematch, one of the early conference games last year. It was not as if Richardson pops off while you're watching the game or film, but he never was stopped, it seemed like, for less than 3 yards. It doesn't mean he's going to get 22, but I did remember that he just kind of was a banger. And whether he's going to get that many carries or not, is that what you remember from that game?
Oh, yeah. That was my first memory of him. I think everyone, if you were at that game, what you remember is the fact that Oklahoma State's offense was not very good last year. But against Baylor, they just very annoyingly ran at a really high tempo and would hand the ball off and get 3 to 4 yards every play and then go for it on 4th down. And there were quite a few plays, especially towards the end of the game. I have a couple of GIFs and an article that I did a really extensive breakdown of Dominic Richardson's game back when he first announced the transfer. I mean, he's like running through Apu Ika. He's making Gabe Hall look like he can't tackle him. He's just really strong. He has that same quality as Abram Smith. They're different running backs. Richardson's not as much of a pure bruiser as Abram, but what really made Abram special was that if the line blocks -1 yards for him, Abram can manage to get 2 yards. And that's a 3-yard difference. And when your running back does that for you on every snap, always falls forward for an additional yard or two, that's what really makes him special. And of course, we know Jeff Grimes and Dave Aranda, they love to go for it on 4th down. And so every yard and every inch really does matter. And so that's what they really missed last year with Squirrel and Quaylen Jones and Richard Reese. Those guys were pretty good at finding the hole and getting the 4 yards when there was 4 yards. But Baylor didn't really have a back last year that could turn 4 yards into 6 yards or 1 yard into 3 yards. And that's how you really kind of keep the chains moving and get this offense rolling.
One of the big questions this year, you kind of alluded to it earlier with the stars conversation that I and others have had, but a position in particular where it's going to be really interesting to see who kind of emerges is at wide receiver. We know a bit about Monterey Baldwin, but as you point out in your article, you know, there's always the availability factor with him because he's not the biggest guy in the world. And Keatron Jackson, highly heralded transfer, but we haven't seen him just yet. On your list, you go with Jordan Neighbors. Why does Jordan Neighbors stand out to you? And I know you do some of the explaining in the article, but for those who haven't had a chance to read it or might not get to it, why does Jordan Neighbors stand out to you amongst the bevy of guys that have an opportunity at wide receiver this season?
Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, I know I'm guilty of overusing this phrase of saying somebody is one of the best athletes in the Big 12. But Jordan Neighbors is truly, he's easily one of the top 3, 4, 5 best athletes on Baylor's team. And he's one of the up there in the conversation for best athlete in the Big 12. His numbers are freaky. He's built exactly like Corey Coleman, kind of that stocky 5'11" frame. His athleticism is just off the charts. And what you really love about his game is that he's a true wide receiver too. When you watch his film, he's not one of these guys that can only run in a straight line. You know, just like Corey Coleman, you can throw him the ball in the flats and he'll make somebody miss and do something special. And so he was a guy that even as a true freshman and even battling through multiple concussions, getting on the field a ton. And wide receiver is just one of those positions where if you're one of the best dudes, they're going to find a way to get you on the field. So even though he's quote unquote, you know, behind Monterey Baldwin at that inside receiver spot, I think they're going to play him a ton this year. And, you know, as you noted there, Craig, with Baldwin's size, you can expect him to miss a few games. And so I just think Neighbors is going to get a ton of play. This offense really kind of shines with those versatile wide receivers that can do everything from take a sweep and an end around, carry the ball out of the backfield to go downfield. We saw that somewhat with Drew Estrada back in 2021. But of course, Gary wasn't the kind of quarterback who could really take advantage of a versatile weapon. So I think with Shapen and Robertson at quarterback this year, they're really going to be able to take advantage of guys like Neighbors that can do it all. He's a really fun guy. His athleticism is off the charts. He's not a, you know, even though the offense kind of gets this reputation as a grinded out offense, which it is, Neighbors and guys like Neighbors, Baldwin, and Keatron Jackson are true difference makers in their ability to really do it all at the wide receiver position.
With Winfield, Cameron also a part of that wide receiving depth chart, how much it's like positions begging for somebody to make a move, right? They're just begging. Monterey's had the big play. We know Jackson, the transfer. Presley, Winfield, and Cameron. Cameron's a great story. Impressive size, I would think. Do you feel like they're going to have at least options, not just those three, with Baldwin, Jackson, and Neighbors?
Yeah, of course. I just think those three are kind of the clear, you know, guys who are maybe going to play at like a first or a second team All Big 12 level. Those are the guys that I think have that potential. No disrespect to a Josh Cameron or even an Armani Winfield, but just at their young stage of their career, I just don't see that it's that for them. So, yeah, I mean, I think as long as you can have a couple of your really top flight guys healthy every game, and then you can have a couple of guys behind them that know what they're doing, that's what you really need. You're not going to have 5, you know, Denzel Mims on your roster every year, but you want one stud and then a couple other really good guys and then a couple other guys who can fill in when needed. So I think hopefully that's what you see this year. Last year, what you saw was just everyone was that kind of, you know, other than Baldwin when he was healthy, everyone was basically kind of at that some good games, some bad games level. And so what you really need this year is just more consistency and, of course, the star power at the top. So it's easy to see how it will roll on paper. But of course, the game ain't played on paper, and these guys need to make it happen. So it'll be interesting to see, because so much of that not only depends on their development, but their rapport with the quarterback. And so I think that's also another interesting aspect of them naming Shapen so early. Can they build that connection? Because so much of this offense is timing based, that it's not going to just be on their ability. It's going to be on their ability to make it flow with them. Offense. I mean, that's what Gary, for all his warts as a quarterback, he had a great rapport with Tyquan Thornton. You could tell he knew where he was going to be. So it's going to be interesting to see if Baylor's quarterbacks can develop that level.
So, Travis, I don't know beyond his suspension how much thought was really given to Garmon Randolph not being on the team next year, but he is your number one guy on this list, and folks can check out the full reasoning and all of that on the website, SicEm365.com, and Travis Roeder's article. But we didn't know anything about the details of the suspension, so how wide did your eyes get when, I guess it was a couple weeks back, they started posting the strength and conditioning numbers, and there was Randolph, and I think he was mentioned a couple times almost in back-to-back days. He's a freak of nature athletically, and I remember what a big get he was for Rule and staff back in the day, but it kind of does seem like, whether it was because of the suspension or just maybe not living up to a certain amount of hype, he's been, I guess, his potential sort of lost in the shuffle, but you highlight the potential that still lies there if he can put it all together this season.
Yeah, he's a really interesting case, because I think this happens sometimes with high school guys that are highly recruited, and Randolph was certainly highly recruited, and it was easy to see why. I mean, he's 6'7", and can move. I mean, he's a lot more fluid and athletic than a lot of the guys who are much shorter and stockier than him. So he's at his size, and with his athleticism at that size, it's really special. So, but what can happen with guys like him is where the reason he didn't go to a Georgia or an Alabama or something like that is just because he was really raw. He needed some development time. And we've seen that since he's been at Baylor. First of all, it was, okay, is he going to play tight end or is he going to play outside linebacker? And so they finally put him on defense. And then both Rule and Aranda, they tried to grow him into that 6'7" frame by making him 290 pounds, but it just never happened. He's always been a guy who sits right around 260 or so. And so basically, even though he's been around a while, he's only been at one position kind of at home for 1 year before this. And so you kind of think about it, he's a 4-year player, but he's only really been at one spot for 1 year. And so now it's finally the time, okay, he's had a year to learn this position. What does he do with it? And so this is a year where I think, fans have kind of said he's inconsistent, and I think it's a lot more of it is just, hey, he's just getting his feet wet at the position. And guys take time. You take these guys out of high school knowing it'll take 5 years. Well, you need to give him 5 years. And so I think the other thing too is that I think he's already been a really good player. The only question for me is whether he can become great. I think he's going to be at least good this year. And I think, fans should not forget that he is, I think if the draft was today, the NFL draft, he would be a late round draft pick. And he certainly has the potential of being a second rounder or something like that. So would I predict him being a second rounder? No, because there's a lot of projection left, but there's not too many guys on this team where you can say, yeah, they could be drafted within the first 3 rounds. Garmon's one of those. He's already a good player. So I think the potential is really high for him this year.
I can't remember if it was him, and it could have been. It might have been. Was it Bryson Jackson? That when they played Oklahoma and Rattler came in, Caleb Williams, of course, had been turned in. They turned him into a pretzel. But there was a play, and I thought it was Garmon Randolph, but maybe Jackson, that hustled. Does he have that motor, that everyday motor that they need, or he needs, or that Aranda would expect?
Yeah, that'll be really interesting to see. Something I noticed, and this is kind of just conjecture and on my part, but I went back and watched a little bit of the Air Force game, just a little bit. But I had in my notes.
Why would you ever do that? You are. We're going to send you into a padded cell.
No. I only did that because I remembered that Garmon played really well that game. And, and that is what really jumps out to me, because he's a guy that, has all the talent in the world. And maybe after a defensive coordinator leaves, he's not from Texas, he's from Georgia. And in this era, when a team has a really disappointing year, and a guy's not from the state, you think, okay, is this guy a transfer risk? And from the first snap of the game, in the worst weather we've ever seen for a Baylor game, he was just playing his tail off. And against a triple option team where as a defensive end, it's not really very sexy to get to play against that offense, right? So that to me was a big sign that after the departure of Ron Roberts, you really saw him playing like that. His dad actually openly commented on our premium site with a comment on my article that kind of gives you some more insight into this. So you can go read that if you want. But I think reading the tea leaves of his dad's comment, it's pretty clear that Garmon is excited to play for Matt Powledge and is going to give it his all this year. And he is a guy that plays with a ton of motor. And I think every guy, once they're finally staring down the final barrel of their final college season, the NFL is looking. I think Garmon's a guy that knows that, there is literally a payoff to where if he has a great year. So I think his motor should be as high as it has been.
Travis, you've given us a good amount of time, but we don't talk to you often, so I'll squeeze one more question in here. Have you been able to wrap your mind a little bit more around the sudden departure of A.J. McCarty and what that means for the defense, for the secondary, and just for the team overall moving into next season?
Yeah, that was a real egg on my face. I had literally written an article like the day before or that morning.
Hey, Levi just wrote an article about Kyle Branch.
I know.
He's in the transfer portal, so kind of happening a lot.
I know. I'm not going to lie. When that happened, I was like, I felt bad for Levi, but I was like, at least, misery loves company. I was like, at least it happened to somebody else. But, I think it's a real loss. I know I was kind of out there in my projections for him. I can tell you that I had multiple reports from this spring that he had a phenomenal spring, like not just a good spring, but a really, really, really good spring. And they were counting on him because they're really, really thin at that position. I don't really have any insight into why he was kicked off the team. But, I think after what Aranda said, Aranda, I think it was in his interview with you, Smokey, that he talked about how he felt like guys took advantage of him last year.
Yep.
So I'm not sure if that's specifically what happened with McCarty. It's not really my role to speculate on that, but from a pure football aspect, I think he's a good player. I think he was going to be a really good player for Baylor this year. And I think the fact that he has to sit out a year, so basically he's a guy who has 2 years left, so he would have to sit out a year to transfer. And the fact that Tech immediately offered him tells you that they think he's a really good player. And Joey's a guy who knows about him. So I think it's a little bit of an awkward situation for the ex-coach to kind of immediately offer him like that after a guy's kicked off the team. That's you can kind of read into that how you will. I think that's just kind of awkward. But I think it is a real loss because this defense, it's not that it doesn't work if you don't have a Jalen Petrie at that star position, but it sure makes it a lot easier to have a dynamic guy there. And while I love Bryson Jackson, I'm not sure that he is a full-on dynamic type player like a Jalen Petrie was. So I don't know. I think they need to move somebody position to be there because I don't think you just want to stick just a kind of an average guy at that position. I think you want to have somebody who really your defense revolves around. So it'll be really interesting to see how they handle that because that's a big question mark going into this fall.
I bet if, in fact, you asked Joey McGuire about offering a guy that was dismissed or whatever the story is, I bet he would probably say, hey, I know A.J. McCarty. I know him really well. And probably had already done his due diligence. It took 7 minutes for him to get an offer because they know him. And if it's somebody like Missouri, I mentioned this last week, it would have taken longer because they don't know him. And they would want to probably look at some film of him. Devin Lemire was number one on Grayson's list that came out today. I liked this young man. He's just kind of really, really smooth. What are your thoughts since he's at number one with Grayson? Your thoughts about Devin Lemire and his ability?
Well, I've been giving Grayson a hard time about Devin Lemire for a long time. Grayson's been Lemire's number one fan. I'm going all the way back to his recruitment. I think Devin's a good player. My main question with him is his health. And I know it's always kind of weird to say, well, can somebody stay healthy? Of course, that's what we all wondered about Squirrel last year, and it reared its head because he got injured before the season even started, and he was never the same wearing that knee brace, even when he was quote-unquote healthy. And so for a guy like Devin Lemire, he's pretty clearly a good player when he's healthy. The problem is that I think the best way to describe Lemire is that he's a linebacker in a cornerback's body. So he loves to play downhill, but he's really thin. And so I think when he's healthy, he's really good. So what I've been told is that his mental side of the game, like he knows how to play coverage. And that's the thing for safeties. Athleticism is everything in the NFL, but the one spot you'll see guys get drafted high in the NFL if they don't have great athleticism is at safety, and that's because the game is so mental. And Lemire I think he's like a mechanical engineering major or something like that. So he's really smart, and he very clearly understands the game really well. He doesn't have great athleticism, but again, at safety, you can kind of get by if you really understand the game. So yeah, he really understands the game. It's just a question of whether he can stay healthy, because if you've ever been next to him, he's really kind of, he's not short, but he is very slight of frame. And so that's kind of my main question with him. Is the same question people had with JT Woods. Is, can these guys stay healthy? So I know it's kind of an unfair thing to hold against somebody, but with football, I mean, that's the name of the game, is being available. So definitely a good player, and definitely Grayson is his number one fan. That's for sure.
Thanks for your time, Travis. Have a great night. Have a great week. Travis Roeder, SicEm365.com is a pretty good